endeavor that was launched 3 years ago toward the Housatonic River Commission and with the cooperation of the Housatonic Valley Association. That plant, knotweed, forms thickets, excludes all other vegetation, native or invasive, in its footprint, scours downriver and establishes along the riverbanks. Riparian knotweed in that area where in the native setting, massive activity occurs in the ecosystem. In the invasive setting, biomass of insects is reduced 96%, according to Doug Tallamy. That affects the entire food web, avian, fisheries, amphibians, invertebrates, etc. In the area of our landscape, which should be the most dynamic. Knotweed, number one, terrestrial invasive in terms of aggressiveness. As mentioned by Roger, the weed that took over the world, according to the Financial Times, arriving in England in the 1850s, arriving in North America in the 1890s, spreading widely, certainly throughout the Northeast and New England, even making an assault on the state capitol. We'll talk later about how that knotweed got there. In our region of the wild and scenic Housatonic, 42 miles of that river, which I've been paddling for 60 years since I was a Boy Scout, much land is conserved from development, but not from invasive intrusion. So we launched in 2018 a iPhone survey of both banks of the entire 42 miles. Is my audio coming through reasonably?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Good. Okay. Okay. So as we approach the covered bridge, we're coming down and we are, I missed the shot there. Okay. Okay, here we go. So we're mapping our way south. Here in the Sharon, Cornwall area, not a lot of knotweed on the Housatonic, in part due to the topography and the fast-moving river. Quite different than the bottomlands up north in Sheffield. But the largest knotweed establishment on the Housatonic River in our region is there right north, 100 yards from the covered bridge, behind what was formerly known as the West Cornwall Garage. So that comprised—
On the Sharon side.
Yeah, on the Sharon side of the river, thank you. A riparian belt of knotweed, and then that upslope belt where the fill that contained the contaminated rhizomes of knotweed was deposited originally. There, just such a short distance from Connecticut's most famous piece of architecture. We were trying to prevent the Cornwall covered bridge from becoming impacted by knotweed the way that only 25 miles upriver, the Sheffield covered bridge, now in a transformed environment, hardly scenic. This, the Bartholomew's Cobble landscape, has that original landscape as it looked in my youth, with Canaan Mountain in the background. And here in Falls Village, Salisbury area, agricultural and native plants coexist. In Sheffield and beyond, a belt of knotweed reaching to the horizon, transforming the ecosystem radically. So we took on the most challenging project on the river in order to, I think, make the claim that it is manageable. With Bob Gambino's crew, we approached this monster patch, even having to use a 12-foot orchard ladder in order to reach the top of the canopy. Here's Bob Gambino treating that section directly behind the garage. He's using 3% glyphosate, which is in a wetlands approved formulation with a wetlands approved surfactant, with a permit from Ed Kirby and the Sharon Wetlands Commission to do this treatment. 1 year after the first treatment, our kill is 95% in the treated areas. You can see we were unable to even reach that center of the upper patch with the mechanized sprayer. Other efforts in the vicinity were attempting to control knotweed with tarping, but was not successful. Stem injection is another method. However, in a situation like ours, it would have used far more chemistry at 2 to 5 milliliters of glyphosate per stem. It's suitable for a small cluster like this, which we treated a few years ago in Canaan and was very successful. Tony Peel, bless his soul, wrote in the Lakeville Journal among his numerous commentaries that glyphosate is killing us all. A week later, Tony took back some of his comments and said, to be perfectly clear, we are not talking about the careful, responsible, safe use of glyphosate by Tom Zetterstrom and others to fight invasive plants threatening our native plant species. Tony, as an avid birder, understood that those birds depended on native plants. Therefore, he was able to weigh the costs and the benefits of doing what we did in order to protect the native plants. Robert F. Kennedy indicates that the formulation of glyphosate alone is far less toxic than the formulation of Roundup. Surfactants known as taloamines are far more toxic than it alone, perhaps 10,000 times more toxic. So it should be said, we do not use Roundup, we're not using the taloamine surfactants. But we're following basically the rules of the world's largest conservation organization, the Nature Conservancy, and their analysis of the use of glyphosate. Its biodegradation time, half-life of several weeks to averaging about 2 months. Just a year after the treatment of the knotweed behind the barn, we have 2 Sharon residents, Jim Saunders and Sharon Tingley, sowing conservation mix there. So we leave the dead stalks in place. They act as a suspended mulch that preserves moisture, will deteriorate as mulch, and allows the what were the dead stalks to succeed into other plants and weeds. So that became that. That's the difference. In that riparian section on the west bank of the river, wow, even like the 9 months after the September treatment in April, on Earth Day of that year, Art Gingert, another avid birder, by the way, from and kestrel hawk, exemplary preservationist, sowed conservation mix. By that June, it came up like this. In the center of the photograph, you see 1 sprig of knotweed that survived that had to be subsequently treated. By August, it looked like this. On the right side, you see another sprig of knotweed that we would subsequently treat. But you can already see the Queen Anne's lace and miscellaneous plants are coming back in. This is less than a year from the initial treatment. Last August, we were down there with Mike Jastrzemski of the Housatonic Valley Association and Debbie Bennett of the Kent Greenhouse, and planning for the restoration of native plants that were installed on October 2nd of this year. Where knotweed grew, native plants are being restored in that same area just above the covered bridge. That was an excellent gathering of about 24 people, including Bill Tingley of the Housatonic River Commission and Mike Jastrzemski of the HVA, and numerous volunteers. And we're grateful to them all. We were encountering that knotweed patch at its biological potential, fully established. Therefore, we had a reactive effort, but we did manage to control it. It would have been a lot easier to manage it at early recognition or near introduction. Japanese knotweed is of concern on roadways as much as it is in the riparian areas because roads and rivers intersect. These young patches, and this one, which was treated by Connecticut DOT, whom we do work with to identify and flag patches. So these could be treated early before they become larger like this. And here we notice that in the relationship of fence and guide rail construction, fill is introduced. And almost 100% of the time where we see roadside knotweed, we recognize disturbance, construction, and fill being brought in as part of that project. Here at a drainage site, knotweed. Along a roadside in Cornwall, just above Stonewall Farm, we see a long stretch of knotweed. And where it might have been introduced, where that little yellow thing is, the drainage basin. But over the years, it's exceeded to the north and south as the mower brought the fragments on the deck of the mower, distributing them up and down the side of the road. At the Connecticut DOT garage in Canaan, we see knotweed growing in fill that is transported into trucks and then distributed at projects. My premise is that Connecticut Department of Transportation is the single greatest planter of knotweed statewide. So we've been talking with Maria Horn about this and are trying to get our handle on that to a greater extent. Here we're looking at the town of Cornwall gravel pit loaded with knotweed, and they have just this year hired Bob Gambino to do treatment of their entire gravel pit. So the town crew is not planting knotweed on their projects. Likewise in Canaan, likewise in Falls Village, the same thing happens. So basically, most of the knotweed that's being planted around the state is human activity, is the vector. Here we see knotweed at a drainage site in Falls Village. It did not fall out of the sky. It actually came off the back of a Falls Village town truck. In Canaan, we have treated the vast majority of our roadside knotweed, and our goal as a town is to become knotweed free on all our roads. Cornwall is embarking in the same direction, but has just begun. But all this patches of knotweed that you can see on the red roads were planted by the Connecticut DOT. On the town roads were likely planted by the town of Cornwall. Therefore, with a grant from the Northwest Connecticut Community Foundation, we hosted a workshop for the town crews of the 7 towns and explained how careful management of roadside invasives with the use of herbicides, glyphosate. Town crews are able to do that. Incidentally, it's part of their state allowed activity. Spray to glisten. Don't spray during the blossom period. Bees will be on there. We avoid that. Line of sight is important to manage, but it's difficult to mow this stuff down 6 times a year in order to do that. Better to treat it with glyphosate and then retreat it and let the natural succession of native weeds return. You can see the remnants of knotweed stalks and back. Here we're doing the same in Canaan. Here we are doing it in our very first year of treatment in 2016 in Canaan, working with the town crew. Actually, just on Salmon Kill, we see worst management practices, backing the brush hog into the knotweed, thinking that you're really doing a good job knocking that stuff down, but really, indeed, what you're doing is flailing fragments of knotweed, which are called propagules, into the flowing water of the Salmon Kill, which of course flows into the Housatonic. Here on the Housatonic survey that I did last summer, I see a knotweed fragment that had floated down, and notice on the bank just behind there, knotweed having been established. Fragments like that will float downstream and hit a sandy bar and become a knotweed island. Here in Massachusetts, where there is zero herbicide use on roadsides, the futile efforts of the Department of Public Works in trying to shove a over the fence mower down as hard as they can into the dirt will do nothing to kill that plant, 60% of which biomass is underground. What they're simply doing there is flailing knotweed into the backwater of the Rising Dale Dam. And, that will result in distribution of knotweed throughout its shoreline. We've recommended, and Maria will make available on the website, the Penn State University roadside management. And I would encourage you, the land trust, to think in terms of, hey, what roads go by your preserves and what invasives should be managed on the roadside before they enter your natural area. This manual of the Department of Agriculture of New Hampshire is really extraordinary. In that state, if your contaminated fill introduces knotweed in a new site, you are responsible for the control of that contamination, something that we should consider in Connecticut. I hesitate to go through all this, but to review what we've just looked at: survey, mapping, thanks to HVA, early detection and rapid response is better. Gravel fill storage should be 100% knotweed free. Otherwise, you're going to continuously shoot yourself in the foot in your town. Propagules should not be spewed into water by mowing. It's actually environmentally smarter to spray than to mow. Treatment methods are extremely effective. You got to monitor for a while because of the nature of the rhizomes. But hey, we got, as you saw, transition to native plant ground cover within less than a year, and then native shrubs and so forth 3 years, 2 years later. Thank you. This becomes this, this becomes this. And these were the cooperators for that project, 3-year project. Bob Gambino and Christian Allen, both commissioners of the Housatonic River Commission, were the principal managers of that project and deserve great credit. Thank you.
Yep, let's go for it, Tom.
Yeah, okay. All right. Mary Moore Preserve. Bittersweet, mechanical control and chemical control and biology. That's what we're going to talk about. A dream landscape of 100 years ago. And in some eyes, an investment opportunity. Some 39 lots. Thank you, Mary Moore, for pulling the rug out from underneath that proposal. Compliments of Deborah Moore. Here's that landscape, probably in the 1930s would be my guess, around the time of the beginning of aerial photography. And you can see agriculture is intense right up to the edge of the hedgerows or the stone walls, man. Those New England farmers didn't let anything go to waste. As that landscape transitions half a century later, we see what is the pre-invasive landscape return to rough and succession growth in the invasive era. So we have basically changed the ball game completely. And thus stewardship deserves the most amplification of effort. The open grown Chinckapin oak that was a pasture tree then becomes crowded by second growth that surrounds it and challenges its perimeter. But the vines go to the top of the crown and challenge the very top of the canopy, which is 92 feet tall. So in Maria's predecessor, Sarah Kuhn, and with David Eman and myself and others, we did cut and treat. Cut those invasive vines, treated them with glyphosate with blue indicator dye, so we killed the roots. Otherwise, we would have been involved in a futile exercise. Here we're treating the sapwood of the bittersweet vine. That was in August. When you looked up into that tree in September, all the leaves had fallen off the bittersweet, but look what was left. The fruit of that plant, those plants in full view. So that Chinckapin oak became a distribution center for bittersweet fruit to be redistributed throughout, carpet bombed really, throughout the entire Marymoor Preserve. In September of that year, Keith Cudworth, the forester for White Memorial, came out and did a certification of the species, made the measurements, 4-foot diameter trunk, estimated to be about 150 years old, nominated to the Connecticut Champion Tree catalog at Connecticut College, crown spread of 101 feet. There it is, a couple of years later with Roger and Christian Allen beneath. Subsequently, haloing, the process of opening a perimeter around an open-grown tree to reduce its crown dieback occurred. And this was the site which we visited after the most recent Doug Talamay talk and the workshops that we hosted afterwards. There now stands a generic sign about Chinckapin oaks. My recommendation is that the specifics of this tree and its site, its agricultural history, and its invasive survival would make a much more interesting interpretive sign about the specific species in the specific site. And I would be happy to work with anybody on that. Again, we were at the near biological potential of that vine in that tree. We were probably 3 years from that tree succumbing. Here we see bittersweet vines at a Salisbury Preserve, Scoville Sanctuary, with Todd Mervosh at the base. And we measured these vines, annual rings, and they went back to the Truman administration. However, we're not even sure if this is the full biological potential of these vines. We know they can go 92 feet tall. We know they can grow 9 inches in diameter. But hey, given them, if we did nothing 50 years later, who knows? On the other side of that equation, 1-year seedlings in 5 minutes can be plucked by the dozens here by Peter Kent. He, in that 5 minutes of effort, perhaps saved 5 trees from future doom. Those little seedlings come out easily. 1-year seedlings to the right come out with their entire roots. 2-year plants, you break off 50% of the roots. Those root fragments will regenerate. Therefore, manual extraction becomes a dicey game. Roger Liddell learned from experience that cutting alone a vine and coming back a couple of years later, he had 5 vines. Here at the Scoville Sanctuary, 4 vines became 45 vines, literally counted. The same applies to shrub invasives, such as autumn olive here. This was my own learning experience on my own property. Compare the fate of the Chinckapin oak, 150-year-old tree, 4 feet in diameter, to my 5-inch diameter hop hornbeam, the hardest of the hardwoods on my own property, with a pencil thickness of a vine crawling up there. But equally safe am I in predicting its certain doom by that vine? One of the slowest growing trees in the understory being taken out by the fastest growing invasive. It should be added, hey, this happens to be a tree with a very high wildlife value. So you can see the ripples of this effect are to diminish the ecological integrity of the trees and the forest and so forth. One quick cut and a dab with a buckthorn blaster, perhaps a milliliter or half a milliliter of glyphosate, can save a tree like that. If you don't want to use glyphosate, hire someone to do it and just tag those trees so you can participate in the stewardship of your own land. Here we have an excellent example of high efficiency use of volunteers on one of the Sharon Plus preserves, where volunteers are cutting and then placing flags at the stem that they just cut. Tim Hunter follows behind them, applying the glyphosate. So Tim doesn't have to come back 3 years later, 6 years later, 9 years later to perform the same act. Say again, Roger?
No, I was silent.
So the tools are simple: a clipper, a glyphosate bottle in the buckthorn blaster, and an old shampoo bottle as a wallet, as a holster. Here we see Roger and Tim looking at some 4 or 5 inch vines going up a perfectly good timber tree, a red oak on Mary Moore. But what you fail to recognize at this season is what that plant hosts in the fall. A mass of seed distribution. So it's important to get in there and get those, especially those fully developed ones. Shifting from the interior woods to the issue of fence rows, we see at Mary Moore a gorgeous fence row dividing the upper field from the lower field, where bittersweet invasion is starting at the south end and will only progress. See, wrong direction. Notice this, the same thing happens across from Beardsley Pond. That hedgerow is doomed if something isn't done. Kent Land Trust did hedgerow protection and one of their preserves south of this town village. And it really adds a great deal of beauty, and it protects the integrity of the trees in the hedgerow. Hedgerows were once assets in farmland. Here we see a red pine, unprotected, now lying on the ground. So therefore, the question of carbon sequestration, kiss it goodbye. Those trees are rotting. Here, root 7, pines that are 80, 90 feet tall will succumb if no one does anything about it. And indeed, they're going to fall toward root 7, which is immediately to the left. Here on Wildcat Hollow Road, on the opposite side of Red Mountain, Paul Church, trying to do his best he can with his backhoe, his excavator, but couldn't get a burn permit. And I don't know what happened subsequently, but he did complain about the bittersweet crawling up into the forest. And that was introduced originally to enhance grouse habitat. On the west side of Red Mountain, on that lower span of the Mary Moore Preserve, in October, the bittersweet canopy becomes more than visible. That was mowed last year. Snag trees, this one was probably the best one that's surviving. Valley of the Shadow of Death is the concept that occurs to me. It's not much of a standing forest in the aftermath of bittersweet impact. So you're left with a situation with a lot of active bittersweet roots. You'll notice that they send out lateral growth and multiple sprouting. Here we mark them with paint just to indicate the extent of that resprouting. At Washini Park, in a meadow that was let's call it 75% bittersweet foliage and barely any grass left. Mowing occurred, and habitat restoration did spot treatment of highly targeted use of triclopyr broadleaf herbicide that does not kill grass, but kills bittersweet. The bittersweet looked like this 2 or 3 weeks later. 2 months later, the grass was filled in, got mowed, and was restored, and the bittersweet was resolved. So just ending on the point, we're in an extraordinary environment that links the northern forests with the mid-Atlantic forests. We have great assets. Preservation is important. My opinion is stewardship goes hand in hand with preservation. The resilient landscape is a concept presented by the Open Space Institute, but when I asked them, well, what if the cattails revert to knotweed? What if the hardwoods are encumbered by bittersweet? What if the understory is crowded by barberry and honeysuckle? Do you have a resilient landscape? Not in my mind. Forest succession, a good concept. It goes back to my Boy Scout days, a predictable pattern of vegetation once freed from cultivation. And a few years later, invading shrubs, tree seedlings, red maples, then the shade of these trees, long-lived species such as beech, sugar maple, and hemlock slowly replace the early arrivals. So when I discuss that with Doug Talame, I say, whoa, doesn't make sense to me. Forest floor congestion leading to inaccessibility, tree crowns encapsulated, exponential increase of seed production, tree death, collapse, expanding ripples of forest collapse, shift from vertical to horizontal vegetation, dramatically decreased carbon sequestration and ecosystem services. Doug Talame agrees. My take is you're exactly right. Succession is dead in invasive zones. It moves to a perpetual tangle of invasive vines, bittersweet, mile a minute, etc. So not to leave you with disappointment, but to leave you with the sense of the celebration of the preservation of the Mary Moore Chinckapin oak, and to take from it the lessons that it can teach us. Thank you.